Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I apologize, first of all, for speaking in English, but my Spanish is extremely limited. And I want to thank our partners in this endeavor, the Global Center in Santiago, the Columbia Global Center, and AthenaLab. We've been planning this for quite a long time now, and it's really been wonderful working with the groups here. And thank you, everyone, for coming in person and those who are joining us remotely. When we started to think about this project on climate change and regional security, I was thinking about what we know about climate change tends to either be at a very global level, thinking about issues of cooperation or lack of cooperation on climate change, or we know quite a lot on the very micro level, what's happening in very specific places or what the effects on one country will be. But there's less in the middle level of thinking about the regional relationships and the regional security that will also be affected by climate change. So that's what we're focusing on today. And I'm joined today by four wonderful panelists, as in the previous panel. Some are joining us on Zoom and some are joining us in person. And so I'd like to introduce Michael Gort, Ambassador from Canada. And our other panelist in person is María Emilia Undurraga. And I took so many notes in the first panel that I'm not finding my notes on introducing our panelists. Oh, please, there we are. So our first speaker today will be Ambassador Michael Gort, Ambassador of Canada to Chile. He's obviously from Canada. He's served previously in Central America and is now the ambassador here in Chile, so he has perspective over the entire Western Hemisphere. Then we will turn to one of our panelists joining us on Zoom, Commander Andrea Cameron, who is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College and the founding director of the Climate and Human Security Group. Then our third panelist, also on Zoom, a colleague from Columbia University, Dr. Josh Fisher, who is the director of a program called AC4, or the Advanced Consortium on Conflict and Complexity, that was part of the Earth Institute, which is now being folded into the new climate school at Columbia University, which we at Columbia are all very excited about. And he works on ecological drivers of armed conflict. And then finally, María Emilia Undurraga, who is a former Minister of Agriculture of Chile, trained as a sociologist and an agronomist, and now the Dean of the Department of, what did you tell me it was called? Department of Nature, which to be the Dean of Nature is really something. So thank you all for joining us, and I'll turn it to Ambassador Gort.
Can I use yours?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Fortna, and buenos días a todas y todos. Voy a comenzar con unas palabras en español, pero después voy a hacer mi presentación principal en inglés y me parece muy oportuno estar aquí en este momento, ya que en Chile hemos visto la temporada de
we've been through this season of forest fires that's been the worst in the past decades, and I would like to say that we're very much affected by this, and of course we are thinking of all those who have lost friends and family and who have lost their houses and jobs. And of course I have to mention too that today, March 8th, I imagine that many people have already said that this is the International Women's Day, and we know that climate change affects the entire world, but it affects the world in different ways, and we know. And there we see that women and children and marginalized groups experience the impacts of climate change in a different way, and the realities are different. Ahora voy a cambiarme al inglés. No quiero dificultarle la vida.
I thank AthenaLab, Juan Pablo Toro, and also Columbia University for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be with the other speakers on on the panel. I've been asked to speak on the impact of climate change on security in the Canadian context. However, I think the threats that we face in Canada, the challenges that we're living, obviously, are very similar to those in the rest of the region and also across the globe. And if it's okay with you, Paige, I'll start with the Canadian context, but obviously you're interested also what's going on globally, regionally, and I'll share, if time permits, a few thoughts on that issue. And since I'm the first speaker here, I'll just state the obvious, and I imagine the previous panel probably addressed this, but the direct impacts of climate change are visible and known, and include polar warming, sea level rise, and coastal erosion, reduced predictability and dependability of weather systems, something I'm going to speak to in a few minutes, increased incidence and/or severity of extreme weather events, such as heat waves, fires, hurricanes, droughts, flooding, and in Canada, of course, severe winter storms. And I'm very glad to be in Chile because we're living through those winter storms at the moment in Canada. And the increased occurrence of such events obviously presents a real and imminent danger. And mainly because climate change acts as a risk or threat multiplier. By interacting with other variables, and these indirectly affect human security, national security, and of course international peace and security. And earlier in my introduction, I was speaking about the recent forest fires here in Chile. We've had them in Canada as well. And these, of course, have been exacerbated by drought and exceptionally high temperatures. And the indirect impacts of these, of course, are damage and degradation of critical infrastructure, the loss, the disruption of food security and economic activity, and of course also the loss of both lives and livelihoods, something that we witnessed here we've witnessed here in the last few weeks. And in other states which are fragile due to poor governance or conflict, or high population growth, other factors as well. Climate change can contribute or exacerbate intrastate or interstate conflict, humanitarian crises, and climate change-induced human displacements within states or across borders. So again, I think I'm not saying anything new or innovative, but even in relatively wealthy countries like Chile and Canada, the effects of climate change will stress domestic response capacity, including security and financial resources, and could also reduce the resources available to deal with government priorities and other threats. And this is a big concern, obviously, for us. Let me just move to my next. So on the Canadian context more specifically, I want to speak about two main climate-related security challenges and tell you a little bit about how we're trying to deal with them in Canada. And the first is the one that I spoke to initially, weather-related natural disasters. And I would say that due to the scale and the frequency of natural disasters in Canada, civilian authorities are actually increasingly relying on the Canadian Armed Forces to support disaster response, which in Canada includes floods, forest fires, and winter storms. And I just want to share an anecdote. You know, not so long ago, in 1999, I was living in Canada at the time. We had the mayor of Toronto in those days was a guy called Mel Lastman, and following a couple of back-to-back winter storms in Toronto that dumped, I think, something like 100 centimeters of snow in the city, he called in the army. He asked for the army to come in and help get rid of the snow, and as a result of that, in 1999, he kind of became the laughing stock of Canadians, of the provinces, and the municipalities. And I think if Twitter had been around then, we would have seen a lot of memes about Mel Lastman calling in the army. But people aren't laughing so much anymore, and more than 20 years later. it was the Minister of Defense himself, Harjit Sajjan, who in 2021 put the army on standby when a catastrophic wildfire basically incinerated the small town of Lytton in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. 90% of the village, including most homes, went up in smoke, and the fires that devastated that town and the community were facilitated by the 2021 Western North American heat wave, with temperatures that reached almost 50 degrees centigrade, which is, I think, 122 Fahrenheit for our American friends and colleagues. And so the involvement of our armed forces in response to natural disasters has broadly doubled every 5 years since 2010. And disaster-related deployments that were taking place only once every other year are now occurring multiple times per year. In fact, they're occurring so often that the Canadian Armed Forces now have a strategy called Operation Lentis, which is basically to manage the response to these severe weather disasters. And the number and scale of people who are deployed is obviously based on the scale of the natural disaster. And in Canada, this has been anywhere from 60 to 2,600 members of the armed forces in a single year. It also includes, obviously, the use of Navy ships, of aircraft, of other vehicles and equipment in order to address these issues. And maybe what I can say about that is that while military personnel involvement in floods and forest fires has certainly helped to strengthen the brand of the Canadian Armed Forces, and is generally welcomed by the Canadian population, I personally wonder whether it is the most appropriate and financially sustainable use of highly trained personnel who've been, trained for combat purposes or peacekeeping, whether it is really appropriate for them to be involved in these kinds of operations. And maybe that's why our own Department of Defense has stated very clearly that armed forces personnel should only be used as a last resort when no other government organizations, federal or provincial, have the capacity to respond. And of course, that's happening more and more, unfortunately. So I want to turn to the second challenge for us in the north, and that's the rising temperature in the Arctic region, in our polar region. And as you know, both Canada and Chile share this. We share a whole lot of stuff, but especially the fact that we're both stewards of the polar regions, the planet's polar regions, which are being affected by climate change at a faster rate than other parts of the globe. And according to some estimates, the Arctic has been warming 4 times faster than the rest of the globe, and Arctic sea ice is shrinking at a rate of 13% per decade. So there's going to be a whole lot left pretty soon. And of course, for us, and I think for Chile, the polar regions represent an important international crossroads where issues of climate change, international trade, and geopolitics intersect. And the melting of glaciers and ice cap carries security and livelihood implications. Obviously, there are challenges. There will be opportunities as well, but notably for local Indigenous peoples in Canada's north, and obviously for coastal people worldwide. And the Canadian Armed Forces anticipate climate change will increasingly affect the safety, the security, and the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples and other Canadians in the north, threaten critical defense infrastructure, and bring added demands to support, as I said earlier, domestic emergency response, as well as search and rescue operations. And climate change, together with the advancements in technologies, is leading, obviously, to a much more ice-free and accessible Arctic. A decade ago, few states or firms had the ability to operate in the Arctic, but today we know that commercial actors from around the world seek to share in the longer-term benefits of an accessible Arctic. including natural resource exploration, fishing, and obviously tourism, among others. And this also includes states such as Russia and China, which obviously have a growing interest in enhancing their military, their commercial, and their industrial presence in the Arctic, with potentially far-reaching geopolitical consequences. And according to Canada's own Chief of the Defence Staff and top military commander, General Wayne Eyre, and I quote, in the decades to come, that tenuous hold that we, Canada, have on our sovereignty at the extremities of this nation is going to come under increasing challenge. And it is because of these challenges that we face and that we've identified that we are increasingly integrating climate change as a key factor in our defense and our international security policies and planning, including our 2017 defense policy, which is called Strong, Secure, Engaged, and in the departmental plans of our Department of National Defense and Global Affairs Canada, our Foreign Ministry. So as a result, we expect to have improved mobility and reach in Canada's northernmost territories and pursue a greater presence in the Arctic over the long term. And this is underway, starting with the commissioning of 6 Arctic offshore patrol ships, of which 2 are already operational. And obviously to support the ships, we're going to need new ports. We have now a Canadian Forces naval facility in Nanisivik, which is actually 700 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle on Baffin Island, Nunavut, and it should be operational in 2023, in this year actually. And obviously other deep sea ports for commercial purposes, including shipping, fishing, and tourism, are at various stages of implementation. I'm going to switch now to what we're doing globally and regionally. I can speak a little bit about specifically the Americas, Chile, but I can also leave that maybe for later if we're beginning to run out of time. I want to talk about NATO and the fact that the impact of climate change on defense and security requires a concerted global approach, and this has been well recognized by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's why within NATO, Canada is actually leading on the implementation of the alliance's climate change and security action plan. And in June of last year, at the NATO summit in Madrid, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, formally announced that Canada would actually establish the NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence in Montreal. And the purpose of the center is actually to drive and support collective awareness of the impacts of climate change and develop adaptation and mitigation efforts across the alliance and its partners. So obviously something to keep an eye on as it becomes operational. And then the second thing I'd like to talk about is our new Indo-Pacific strategy, Canada's new Indo-Pacific strategy. I know I've talked a little bit about it with Juan Pablo. We all know the growing significance of the Indo-Pacific region, home to the largest population in the world, and really the world's new economic center of gravity, likely to make up 2/3 of the world's middle class by 2030, and over half of global GDP by 2040. And Canada recognizes this and has just published for the first time. In fact, we didn't often refer to the Indo-Pacific as a region until last year, but we've published for the first time an Indo-Pacific strategy, and this lays out how our government will be stepping up its footprint, its capabilities, and also its engagement in the region, partly in response to China, that is increasingly aggressive and disruptive, and is actually seeking to rewrite the global rules-based order that it has benefited from for so long. So, given that the Indo-Pacific actually accounts for more than half of global emissions, and this is where I get to climate change, and for most of the world's transboundary pollution, from plastics and marine litter to air pollution, Our strategy, and I'm not going to get into the other details of the strategy, but actually includes addressing environmental needs and priorities of our partners in the region through targeted and responsive engagement in line with our global commitments to effective action on combating climate change, reducing environmental degradation, and of course, fostering sustainable development. Canada will also support the region's low-carbon and clean energy transition, as no region will be more consequential than the Indo-Pacific in shaping our ability to meet and exceed our global commitments and targets on climate change. We will also support sustainable and climate-resilient infrastructure in the region through this Indo-Pacific strategy, using responsive investments with the highest potential for gender-responsive development impact. And our strategy will also enable Canada to share expertise on disaster risk resilience, help Indo-Pacific countries adapt and mitigate the results of climate-induced disasters and climate partnerships. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I can stop there and...
Yeah, maybe let's stop.
Yeah, does that make sense? Okay, all right, okay, thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Gort. We'll turn now to Commander Andrea Cameron, who's joining us on Zoom.
Much to Columbia University and Paige Fortna for including me in this event today. You can hear me? So with so many exceptional government leaders and scholars as part of this event today, I thought I'd briefly present in two areas on the topic they wanted me to talk about, which was climate change as a security variable. So first, I'll give a political scientist academic perspective that probably picks up on the opening remarks given by Professor Jack Snyder. And then I'll give my brief military perspective, probably a preview for the following panel. I'd like to note that everything I say today is my own thoughts and does not represent the Naval War College, the Department of the Navy, or the US government. So if you look classically that politics can be defined as the authoritative distribution of resources, another way to look at that is determining who gets what, when, and how. What we do know is that climate change is already altering the dynamics of how we determine who gets what, when, and how. And in this sense, the issues in regional security is that different regions will experience climate change impacts differently, as many of our speakers today have discussed. So this places additional level of tension on the who gets what, when, and how, because the leaders will have to make increasingly more choices about the resources they have available and where they go. We experienced this in the United States. The ambassador just talked about it in Canada. And this is very similar to the southern part of South America as well, because you have a wide variety of emerging climate hazards that will needed to be dealt with regionally and nationally. Now, myself as a political scientist, I'm looking at kind of this study of the institutions, the behaviors, the decision-making, and the processes. One thing that is exceptional about all these kind of political science theories and the actual practical systems we've built, whether they're political, economic, or social, is that they've all been built on the assumption of a stable climate, which has existed for the last couple hundred years. And this leads to the grand political science questions of climate change. How does the changing climate affect the foundations of these institutions and processes that we've built? Can we socially construct equity into society and decision-making, like through the climate and environmental justice movements? Or will a liberal approach work, like what John Ruggie suggested? Are our international institutions sufficiently fit for purpose to address climate change in the timeframe needed to have results? We are trying this. This is particularly evident in the mitigation targets set forth in the Paris Climate Agreement and our own respective nationally determined contributions. Or what we may see is kind of this return to devolving into a more realist approach where every state focuses on themselves, less concerned about stability of their neighbors, or perhaps even intrastate tensions will arise as well. Adaptation measures can have the potential to do this, sometimes causing more harm than good. This is why regional tensions can emerge. There's a wide range of policy choices that we have to address climate change. Many of them have been discussed today. And these can lead to positive security outcomes, negative security outcomes, or sometimes we can just take action that has very little impact at all. So based on all of this, what do we as political scientists and global leaders need to understand to the best of our ability which policy interventions lead to the positive security outcomes? When Paige first invited me to come talk today, she suggested the talk Climate Change as a Security Variable, which appealed to me as a political scientist because there is a good bit of work being done on kind of establishing the climate to conflict pathways. So I thought I'd really just kind of hone in on that briefly. When you're looking at climate change as a security variable, what we're trying to do is attempt to calculate the risk involved. And to do this, there's a couple, kind of three categories to consider. First is, what are the climate hazards themselves? What is the exposure to risk? Is it drought, heat waves, flooding, wildfires, or sea level rise? That affects all of our countries. Now, we're kind of fortunate, and the state of the science is doing a better and better job in modeling these climate hazards. Most importantly, none of these hazards are drawn where respect the lines on the map. So they make some regional hazards that require regional solutions. The second set of variables is where it gets trickier, and these are the additional risk factors. I'll give some examples for your consideration because they're often measured when we look at elements of state fragility. One factor is, what is the primary source of employment for the people working in a country? Countries that are highly dependent on agriculture, livestock management, forestry, and fishing are particularly vulnerable to climate hazards. Another compounding factor might be poverty, because it leads to fewer safety nets due to limited resources. In addition, are there subsets of the population who are marginalized from political or economic engagement? These might be ethnic, religious, cultural, or socioeconomic groups. And this is particularly true when those groups don't have an established venue to address grievances. Because of their lack of political options, they might tend to resort to violence to get their voice and needs heard. And finally, recent unrest within a country and armed conflict can weaken the governance structures to address it and possibly lead to a resurgence of violence if there's still unresolved points of friction. So this is our second category of factors, this additional risk factor. So you have the climate hazards plus these additional risk factors. Now, third is the government responses. And this might be where we might have the greatest impact to increase resilience in the decisions of who gets what, when, and how. Does the state have the capacity to make decisions regarding climate hazards before, during, and after events? This is why we have the opportunity to work regionally. The climate hazards and the additional risk factors both tend to cross the lines on the map. So we tend to think of those across the lines, but we think of solutions within the lines. But we need to think of them more regionally because of the way the threats present themselves. So in sum, the likelihood that a country will experience climate-related armed conflict is a function of these three interrelating elements: the country's exposure to climate hazards, the additional risk factors, and the government's responses. What political scientists are trying to do is figure out which of these variables lead to tension, hostility, instability, and conflict. And the better we understand these pathways to conflict, we at home and with our partners can work to develop interventions that lead to the positive security outcomes. In addition to the exceptional work being done at Columbia University, if you're interested further in this type of research, I recommend some of the work by my colleague Joshua Busby. Now, my second thought today is a brief comment about the role of militaries in addressing climate change. In general, to increase the likelihood of cooperation in political, economic, and science sectors, which is really where we focus our climate negotiations, it's broadly accepted that we do not securitize climate change. In addition, good governance, development, and diplomacy should be the key sectors of engagement. I make no argument with any of those incredibly important points. But if we move forward with our understanding that stability is strongest when a state has the capacity to absorb the shocks of a climate stress, then the defense sector is a large part of state capacity that's an available resource. The ambassador from Canada gave a great example of how many ways this is being used within his country. I will point to the two countries directly, the United States, my own, and Chile. So in the United States, for legal reasons, we only use the military as a last resort, and we're primarily excluded from domestic response. It's only when local and federal civil systems are beyond capacity that we consider how to use these military resources. And for those reasons, we don't necessarily prioritize on how to capitalize on all the available resources. And now I'm going to juxtapose that with my colleagues in Chile, who have a well-developed system of integrating the defense community as part of the first responders. This is an essential emergency management option, particularly in times of crisis response. When people have asked me for years which countries do this well, Chile is always top of my list as an example of how civil and defense sectors can work together in this type of operation. And once again, if we tie it back to the theory that stability is enhanced by the most robust state capacity being prepared, then the Chilean approach is a one to emulate. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to this event, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Now we turn to Josh Fisher, also joining us on Zoom.
Hola, ¿me escuchas?
Yes.
Perfecto. Pues bueno, muy buenos días a todos y feliz Día Internacional de la Mujer. Mi nombre es Joshua Fisher, soy investigador y director de un centro de investigación en la Universidad de Columbia, enfocado en el nexo entre paz, conflicto y la sostenibilidad ambiental. Muchísimas gracias al personal del equipo de esta conferencia por la invitación, también a Dr. Paige Fortna.
And also Dr. Paige
Es un placer.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today. For the rest of my comments, I will speak in English. Bien, entonces gracias a todos por la oportunidad.
It's a really important topic that we're here to discuss, and I appreciate the chance to contribute. Many of my remarks are going to be complementary to what's already been said. So, in the interest of time, I'll try and keep them rather short, and just try and tie together some of the points that some of my previous colleagues have made. This morning, I'd like to discuss the theme of climate and security and the ways in which these are linked in Latin America. For much of the last 10 years, I've spent a lot of my time as both a researcher, doing some of the quantitative modeling that Commander Cameron discussed, as well as a practitioner or a science policy advisor. I've worked quite extensively in several parts of Latin America, using social and natural sciences to support decision-making at the very local level regarding peace, conflict, sustainability, environmental management, as well as peace building. So I come with sort of a grounded perspective to this discussion, but I'm also a global north researcher and scholar, so I have certain blind spots and a certain limited perspective. So for preparation for this panel this morning, I spent a lot of time reviewing some of the recent scientific literature, some of the recent empirical modeling, and some of the policy work from my colleagues in the Latin American region, some of whom I will reference today. So there are three main points that I'd like to reinforce today, and if you take nothing from my comments, these are the three key highlights. In terms of the climate, conflict, insecurity, or security linkages, the first point is that climate change and climate variability are not direct causes of insecurity in the region. Instead, they multiply threats or catalyze existing social grievances and fractures into conflicts and points of insecurity. So climate change itself, not a cause of conflict, rather, as previous colleagues have mentioned, a threat multiplier or a catalyst for conflict. And the second point for my comments is that in the short term, the near term, sort of as my colleague Walter was mentioning now, this destabilizing impacts of both sudden onset climate anomalies and slower onset cumulative anomalies. These destabilizing impacts are felt more at the local level and more intranationally inside countries rather than across borders. That said, longer term anomalies and our longer term time horizons, we really need to start thinking about how we can restructure our national institutions as well as international institutions for greater regional stability and greater regional resilience. And the third point that I'll try and briefly touch on is that the institutional context of many countries in the region amplifies the vulnerabilities associated with environmental justice, climate justice, and broader social justice, making it difficult to adequately plan and implement effective adaptation and mitigation strategies. So as we work to redesign the institutions, we need to keep justice, equity, and collaboration really at the forefront of our policymaking. So I'll touch on each of these briefly and then leave time for questions and our other colleague on the panel. So with regard to the first point, climate change is an indirect threat or a risk multiplier. As Commander Cameron discussed, there's been a real surge in the academic literature looking at the linkages of climate and conflict, and particularly the ways in which, or the pathways through which climate drives insecurity and conflict. On the large N or empirical modeling side, there's been a lot of work and fabulous work, both in Latin America and abroad, that highlights some of the key linkages, the ways in which temperature extremes, for instance, give rise to conflict, the ways that flood events lead to migration, which lead then to destabilizing of recipient countries or cities or regions. The problem with the empirical literature right now, at least as I see it, is that a lot of the findings, the statistically significant findings, the patterns that we're seeing are scale dependent. So they hold at a certain temporal scale, a certain spatial scale, a certain social scale. But as soon as we start to either zoom in or zoom out, those trends and patterns quickly lose their significance, lose their statistical power, and we lose our ability to generalize broadly. And so there's been a lot of really great qualitative work and case study work that takes a more micro look at what's happening in the region, what these linkages are, and fills in some of the nuance that the empirical studies and the large N studies can't have. And this work has been really fundamental for some policymaking, for some coordination among regional actors. However, it has that same sort of scale dependency that makes it difficult to extrapolate lessons for broader regional and broader long-term policymaking, especially around adaptation, mitigation, and conflict prevention or peace building. And there's some great theoretical work also coming out of the region that's really foundational and fundamental, but again, difficult to implement. So despite these limitations, there's a general consensus that I see in the academic literature, at least, that climate, conflict, and security linkages in Latin America are under-researched. We just don't have enough high-quality studies coming out that are specific to this region to really provide the evidence base for informed policymaking. So there's a need to build this evidence base. That said, there's also a general consensus in the region that climate is an indirect driver of conflict and insecurity rather than a direct cause, as I said earlier. And the pathways through which this linkage exists, they tend to exacerbate different sorts of social grievances, different sorts of policy conflicts. But broadly, they can be grouped into a few categories, including disruption of agricultural and natural resource dependent livelihoods and value chains, which enhance grievances and marginalization for some groups of some societies. As well, though, these climate change disruptions cause problems in urban areas and livelihoods and value chains associated in the urban setting. And so as Latin America is increasingly urbanized, climate change will continue to disrupt both the rural livelihoods as well as the value chains that support urban areas. So the second pathway is the disruption of ecosystem services that either buffer communities and cities from climate change shocks or that provision the goods and services needed to survive. So this disruption of ecosystem services is really the critical link that destabilizes regions, destabilizes societies, and opens the door for that climate conflict catalytic reaction. The third pathway is, as my colleague Susana Adamo was discussing, increased migration from vulnerable or climate impacted areas that lead to demographic shifts and activate existing social tensions or create new social tensions. For instance, migration from the Andean highlands to the Amazon lowlands, or from impacted rural geographies to peri-urban geographies, or from flood-prone areas in urban areas to other areas. These demographic shifts start to destabilize societies and can open the door again for that catalytic reaction. The fourth pathway is, as my colleagues have also mentioned, the lack of administrative and public infrastructure needed to mitigate and adapt to these climate anomalies, as well as the capture or exploitation of social and institutional vulnerabilities, leading to additional exposure for some communities to illegal and illicit trade networks, organized crime, and other vectors for risk to societies and communities. So these four pathways in the literature, at least, are right now tending to be the major linkages between climate conflict and insecurity. A recent review titled Climate and Security in Latin America and the Caribbean, which was produced by the Igarape Institute and Instituto Clima y Sociedade out of Brazil, provides a very thoughtful exploration of many of these pathways from a regional perspective and from scholars in Latin America. So with regard to the second point, climate is a near-term intranational security issue. We've again heard this from several of our colleagues. I don't need to repeat too much, but the immediate short-term and medium-term impacts of increased climate variability, shifting temperature and precipitation regimes, as well as the climate trends we're seeing in various subregions in Latin America, are being manifest as insecurity mainly within countries rather than across borders. We know, as different colleagues have said, that the region faces some real challenges in terms of inequality within countries, marginalization of certain vulnerable groups, including indigenous communities and gender groups, lack of trust in governing institutions, violence against environmental activists, which is a real issue in some countries, issues of access to and tenure of land, as well as economic and social fractures that were magnified by the pandemic. All of these issues create vulnerabilities that are easily catalyzed into social conflict, expressed through either violence or capitalized in illicit trade networks and organized crime. Last year, the World Meteorological Organization released a report titled State of the Climate in Latin America and Caribbean in 2021. And that report reinforces a lot of these regional and sub-regional climate trends and ties them to social and socioeconomic impacts at the regional level and at the sub-regional level. So definitely worth taking a look at. Importantly, though, much of the pathways and socioeconomic impacts that report highlights really reinforce these pathways that the report by the Igarape Institute highlighted. In any case, it's clear that the impacts of climate change are creating or amplifying existing fractures in many corners of the region, and this will be the main scale of insecurity in the near term. Longer term, though, there's some important global and economic and structural trends that could further exacerbate international and regional or transboundary tensions. For example, the push to decarbonize the economy is fueling rapid growth in the lithium sector. Much of the world's lithium is produced in the lithium triangle in Chile, Argentina, and Peru. However, the changing hydrology of the region, coupled with the expansion of the extractive industry sector, is creating threats to water security and could potentially undermine the ecological viability of water-dependent ecosystems. So this creates a paradox where our near-term adaptation strategies create a boomerang effect that undermines the region's long-term resilience and sets the stage for transboundary, and industry, government, community conflicts. So this all leads to my third point, the need for institutional reform that holds justice, equity, and collaboration as core principles in adaptation, mitigation, and conflict prevention. We all know that there are global disparities in wealth, hazard exposure, access to services, all of these things can undermine resilience in the face of climate shocks. These disparities are particularly pronounced in Latin America, where vulnerable groups are disproportionately exposed to both climate shocks and insecurity. So increasing justice and multiple types of justice, social, environmental, climate, has to be a critical policy agenda in the coming years for the region. We can argue the moral or normative imperative for expanding justice, enhancing justice in the region, and I'm a particularly ardent advocate for that moral and normative perspective, the ethical argument. But there are some important practical reasons that we need to think about increasing equity, justice, and collaboration in the region. I recently published a book titled Managing Environmental Conflict, in which I describe the phases of conflict escalation and tie it to our ability to operate and implement policies to both prevent conflict as well as de-escalate some of the existing tensions that exacerbate conflict. And the idea is that the higher intensity of conflict becomes, the smaller the decision space that we have for action. Conflict tends to collapse parties into positionality and decreases the ability to collaborate or coordinate response. So high intensity conflicts have a small decision-making space. In contrast, low-intensity conflicts, latent conflicts, have a much broader decision-making space. So we can use things like climate adaptation strategies, mitigation measures, as tools for peace building. Critical to de-escalating conflict or preventing conflict from escalating into higher intensity forms is social capital. Social capital turns out to be really, really critical for building trust among parties, facilitating coordination among parties, and overcoming some of the collective action dilemmas that parties in conflict face. And key to constructing social capital is justice. There really can't be the construction of social capital without forward-thinking measures to introduce and reinforce justice and principles of justice, both distributional, procedural, retributive justice, as well as climate justice and environmental justice. We really can't build the social capital needed for conflict prevention if we don't have justice at the core. So rather than being an ethical, moral imperative, justice turns out to be really, really important in sort of a mechanistic way for conflict prevention, which can then open up the space for a variety of adaptation and mitigation measures. So with that, I think I'll pause my remarks and leave time for our other panelists and hopefully questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. And now, last but certainly not least, we turn to our fourth panelist, Minister María Emilia Undurraga.
Thank you. No? Buenos días, todavía muy buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por esta invitación a AthenaLab, Paige, embajador, y a todos los que nos acompañan. Muchas gracias por esta invitación y la inclusión de la seguridad alimentaria en este marco que estamos hablando de relaciones internacionales, seguridad, defensa, justicia y tantos términos que aquí hemos acuñado para poder ver la diversidad de aristas que tiene el enfrentar el cambio climático a nivel global, a nivel nacional y a nivel local. Cuando hablamos de seguridad alimentaria, la seguridad alimentaria no es un problema para los que producen, es un problema global que requiere ser pensado en un sistema donde la seguridad es crucial. Ya lo vimos en la crisis de la pandemia, lo vamos a analizar después a continuación con los conflictos, especialmente el conflicto en Ucrania a nivel global, cómo ha impactado los mercados alimentarios, y a nivel nacional, como conflictos internos, lo vemos en la macrozona sur, que es una región productora, cómo impacta también en la producción de alimentos dentro del país. Y es por eso que durante la mañana hemos podido conocer distintos antecedentes y cómo el cambio climático impacta actualmente a los recursos naturales. Esto actualmente ya nos tiene enfrentados en conflictos, lo que ocurre, por ejemplo, con el Silala, con el agua, lo que ocurre con los acuíferos entre Chile y Perú, internacionalmente conflictos donde el agua es hoy día un factor relevante. Y es por eso que además, considerando el agua como elemento fundamental para producir los alimentos de la familia, empieza a tornar esta seguridad alimentaria.
This food security starts becoming a reality that requires to be seen and analyzed with those different points. And it is also important to note that when we talk about climate change and its challenges, we're talking about mitigation and adapting. Measures and proposals in both areas has effects, has implications in security, and it is important to analyze them not only globally, as many presenters have mentioned, with global measures, but these, how do they talk with local reality, which is very different, and how it also impacts that reality in the different levels. As others presenters have said, vulnerability regarding climate change is very different. I brought this map. This map represents vulnerability, water vulnerability. Redder the color is, we have areas that have a high probability of decreasing the water flows. It is to say that we will be confronted to extended droughts. And as you can see, this happens with temperature, with the weather events or climate events that have been mentioned. And as an average, we could say there will be less water availability. That is very different, not only amongst countries, but also amongst regions of the same country. We have global measures, but at the end, the needed measures are the ones that are local, that allow to adapt to the consequences of this global change. And as we were also saying, this crisis that we are currently analyzing, this food security from its impact in climate change, we can add other crises, the pandemic crisis. The pandemic was a very important factor in food security. And with even more, what happened last year, crisis due to the conflict in Ukraine. And we will analyze why the defense part of these things is important. Because last year, when we saw biggest increase in prices on food, this is a series of prices from the year 1960s to date. Those price hikes were not, it's because we didn't have food. It was given that the logistics did not allow that the produced food would get to consumers. And that's why mainly the biggest increase was given with the by the Ukrainian conflict, and that's why it is important to analyze it from this perspective also. And it is important not only due to a specific conflict and the effects that we have, but under the framework that the world population still increases. We exceeded 8 billion people, and for 2030 there will be increase for food demand of 20%. And this we will have to do. We will have to produce them with less water, less soil. There will be more knowledge and cooperation, which is important to consider. That's why this instance is relevant. And not only will affect only one of the sustainable development goals, but to the 17 that in one way or another are related with the climate change and the well-being of people. And this is the graph that I wanted to show you. I think when we talk about food security, many times we focus on production, on how food is moving.
Este es el indicador final. Este gráfico representa
What has to move us is the final indicator. This represents how we have been confronting on a world level the amount of people that currently go to bed with food insecurity. X amount of people live with a food, 10% of the population live with insecurity, food insecurity. And this shows that in 2015, which was the year that we agreed on the objectives of sustainable development, there were 583 million people with food insecurity. And this, which presented to be an objective that would let us come together, not only has increased, getting to indicators previous to 2005. So we have gone back more than 15 years in terms of food insecurity. Another factor that we will not touch in this conference is the other side of the coin. Obesity. That's another pandemic that, of course, is not part of this, but it's also important to consider. But because when we talk about food insecurity, we should at least differentiate three areas. First is the availability. Many times we focus on that. When we talk about food insecurity, we call the food producers, and of course availability. To have food is a challenge of the area, but we should also remind ourselves that availability is not only produced internally, but also in other countries. We will talk about the exchange. That's why this is the important exchange, international trade, and the protocols and treaties are relevant, but also distribution and logistics, fundamental topics when we analyze the defense of national security. Another factor is access. We can have food, but the important thing is that people can have the resources in order to acquire that food. And currently what we've seen in the crisis during this year, it is not an issue of food availability. Food production in the world is enough to feed people. The issue is the issue of access, where many people do not have access to. And when we talk about availability, which is the production of food, we must consider that in general, countries produce around 75% of the food they consume. That's a general average. That's a lot. And the countries that almost depend 99% on food from abroad. But countries produce an important percentage of that food. An average, as I say, 75%. But that varies amongst products. In case Chile, that we produce great part of our food, and we have a positive trade balance, depending on the international trade, and very important products, for example, wheat, rice, in more than 50%. There you can see the amounts. We import 50% of the rice. We import 83% of the wheat for production of white meat, rice, X amount percentage. And that's why I go back in the relevance of talking about food security and an aspect of a broader security issue. It's a strategy, I would say, that's fundamental for the development of different countries. I already showed you this graph before, which requires to confront food security not only from the availability of how we produce much better, more efficiently, more sustainable, but how do we make that these products will be accessed by different families, and that's given by the price of food. And that impact in prices will also notoriously vary amongst countries. In average, last year we had a food inflation at a world level of 14%, approximately. Chile had a 24% of increase in food prices. There are countries in the region that have had more than 100% of price increase on food. That's why the global analysis that we know that it is important, at the end we have to bring it to local analysis that could show the real impact in each one of the countries, and later on we will also see how within the countries it impacts differently and its implication on security. We know that food is basic for people's well-being, and it's a fundamental factor that has pushed many conflicts, internal as external. So that's why it is important to consider. And this other graph that shows the percentage of expenditure of families in food. While countries are poorer, here we see in red color how many countries spend more than 50% of their budget in food. So when we have a food crisis and an increase in food prices, it's different if you spend 50% of the budget in food than 10%. And that's why the Ukrainian war, in terms of food, the biggest effect was in the African countries,
Porcentaje mayor de alimentos.
who also import a greater percentage of food. And the effect of climate crisis, armed conflicts, and also the pandemic, it is important finally to lower this in each one of the countries. And in each one of them, not only at a country level, Chile more or less spends 18% of its budget in food. But within Chile, when we look at the different groups, the poorest families, 20% poorer families in the country, spend 1/3 of their budget in food. And that's important for national security, for regional conflict, and also for international conflicts. And here also, I'm almost ending with the challenges. When we talk about these global challenges, when we talk about this global threat, finally we have two working areas. We have to adapt ourselves, and for the food area or industry is fundamental. Food is produced based on climate, water, soil, temperature, and that's putting pressure on the systems, putting pressure on some areas, and we must say it. This will happen in Canada and the countries up north. Also having other areas that do not have conditions to produce that will be added. Not only how we adapt in places where we have pressure, but also how we will enable other areas that will grow in a sustainable way food for this growing population. And we cannot also consider what we do in mitigation, what we do in adapting, because here there's an effect that's not only independent, it's specifically in the agricultural and food industry. Many mitigation measures affect possible adaptation measures, and that's why the integral point of view is fundamental. And here, just to end, and then later to be able to go to the Q&A round, it is important to make a call of cooperation, to cooperate of the public sector, private sector, and the civil society. This is not a problem of the government. This is not a problem of the private companies. It's not a problem from one or another group. And this new challenge, I'm here for creating a science faculty for nature and asking ourselves for the assets of nature in this context, in this pressured environmental context, and how from there, from research, as other panel members mentioned, we are missing a local research in order to be able to take measures according to the reality of each country. And that's why to be able to have public, private, and civil society cooperation from all of these groups is fundamental. And also this integral view that invites us to look on the economical side, social side, and environmental side, because at the end, when we talk about objectives of sustainable development, it is important that we can balance out proposed measures. It's also the consequences of them, and what we finally want to have as objective at a national, regional, and of course, a local impact that these have. So thank you very much for this invitation, and I'm really happy that this food topic is becoming part of the discussion that has a lot to learn from the panel members, and also be able to contribute in this basic view of taking position of the food production in our countries. Thank you.
Tengo una pregunta.
Us on schedule. Okay, I'll take one question. The gentleman in the middle with the hand up.
Centro.
Aló, 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 aló. ¿Aló? ¿Se escucha?
Good afternoon, I think. There is some kind of phantom going around in this room. I am happy that there is one person related to education, but no reference was made to education. The question is open for anybody in the panel. What's the importance of education here in terms of resilience and security, everything that is affecting us every day? Well, thank you for the question. I think that education is fundamental, and I believe that here in this room there are many people connected to education, not only formal education. We've got AthenaLab, who promotes research, of course, the Columbia University, and I think research and investigation should erase the barriers to the academia, and we have to be open to understanding that this is a process of each and everyone in the public and private sector and civil society to have better evidence, to take better decisions, make better decisions. So that's why, okay, the government has to make public policies, or the university has to do this, or schools have to do this at a very low level, because of course, things start with a change of culture that each one of us have to do every day to contribute to, and that depends on education. But I think that education is not only schools and universities, of course, thanking the Columbia University for this encounter, but we have to educate each of us, each and every one of us, and as part of a process, and that helps us to be connected in this change.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias. No tenemos.
Not to let the panelists answer them, but just to throw out a few questions from our that came in just for our consideration as we think about the third panel. One is about the issue of crime and criminal organizations and how they might be affected by, or the ability to deal with crime would be affected by climate change. And then also a question about how we as political scientists, diplomats, policymakers think about the issue of the compounding layers of uncertainty when we think about the future, both a future of unmitigated climate change or a future with aggressive mitigation and a rapid energy transition, both of which incorporate a lot of insecurity, and then there's also the insecurity of where we will be between those two extremes. So quite a lot to think about there. So thank you so much interesting material from our panelists that we ran out of time. I apologize to the audience that we weren't able to take more of your questions. We now have a very short, for those of us here in person, a short break and a light lunch outside, and for those of us online, please stick around and join us in about 40 minutes for the third panel. Thank you so much.